Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, July 9th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part two. Last week we presented part one, World Trade Center 7. Today, in part two, we'll look at the Twin Towers' explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. Now, before we go further, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele, who's also the host of 9/11 Freefall. Hey, Andy.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Richard. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You can submit them in the box in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education on our website and look for the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. I'll also be looking at our Facebook broadcast of this webinar and our YouTube broadcast for any comments or questions related to the material that Richard's going to be covering, and include those well as I see them or if I see them. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project. It's near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So with that in mind, let's get right into it. The Twin Towers. Some, in terms of its design, called it the crowning achievement of the international style. Others, heartless modernism. Robert Stern, famous architect, calls it gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world, outpacing the Empire State Building, which was the tallest building in the world at the time of the construction of the Twin Towers. That aside, we have some incredible engineering innovations, not the least of which was the passenger elevators, which got 50,000 occupants with almost 100 elevator cabs in each of these towers to their destinations in a series of 3 stages. They would go up to the second or the upper stage. If they or the first stage, first, second, and third. Quite novel. We have an incredible occupant load in these towers that they were designed for. Anyway, some said they were empty, half empty near the time of the collapse. But even more impressive is the structural engineering, because up to this time, we had a forest of columns in these buildings, including the Empire State Building. But with the Twin Towers, what happens is we have prefabricated elements, 3 columns by 3 spandrel panels welded in the factory, brought out and set with the cranes and bolted in place. They had moved half of the columns out to the outside, as you see here. And then on the inside, we had a massive series of 47 incredibly large and robust core columns and up to solid steel at the base. And then between these these two different structures really spanned these lightweight steel trusses. Now, these were the vulnerable trusses, vulnerable to fires, as claimed by the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. So we'll be looking at that in some detail today. And over these lightweight trusses were poured 4 and 8 inch thick concrete slabs. So it's really quite a structure. We're talking about an acre size in these buildings, and 60 feet open office area on 2 sides, and on the other sides 35 feet. That's in itself was quite an innovation. As you can see here, most all these floors were open, and they were allowed by these steel trusses. So this hadn't been achieved at all. That forest of columns really impacted the the planning of the tenants' office spaces. Now, on the outside, what you see is a series of marching columns all the way around the building. And in the 80s, particularly, these views started increasing without all these columns around the outside as structural innovations continued. So some likened this unto a jail cell with bars all the way around after the 80s and 90s particularly. And then it also had lower ceilings than most skyscrapers at 9 feet here, given the long space particularly. And they were requiring mechanical, electrical, and communications updates in these buildings, and the asbestos was required to be abated. So you had what amounted to a $5 to $10 billion requirement of updating these buildings at the time that they were secured by Larry Silverstein and his fellow investors. He putting $125 million of his money and then leveraging that up to $3.2 billion and obtaining the properties just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. So, and putting all kinds of terrorist insurance, massive quantities of terrorist insurance, of which he walked away with $6.8 billion. So that's just some interesting background. Let's see what the official story yielded and how that came about here on the morning of 9/11.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken.
Andy, I just want to make sure you can hear really well the video, because I might have set it up
It
wrong.
sounds a little low.
All right, I'll fix that. Sorry about that. That happens when I share my screen without first. We're going to pause the video and unshare the screen. And then we're going to reshare the screen. And we're going to share it by clicking the share audio button. Now everybody knows. And then we'll go back to the video. Is that better, Andy? Pretty quick here.
It sounds a little higher. It's still kind of low, though.
Burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way.
That's all I can do for now.
A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust.
We ran to the hotel building and went into the
Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just screamed right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
And it keeps stopping. We'll just continue clicking.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
So that's the official story in a nutshell. Where it came from? Maybe the guy on the street, the bozo who provided that expert opinion, or it was provided to him perhaps to establish the narrative here. But let's look and see. The North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning. It collapses over an hour and a half later. And so some people equate the impact of the airplanes and the massive explosion there to the collapses. But no, there's a lot of time here. In fact, NIST acknowledges that the jet fuel, 90% of it was burned up outside the building. The rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. So we have normal office fires acting for an hour to an hour and a half. In the case of the South Tower, it's an hour almost later that the building collapses. The South Tower was hit second, but it was the first to collapse. It was hit about 30 stories down, whereas the North Tower was hit about 15 stories down. So there were investigations into the structural failures here. The American Society of Civil Engineers put together volunteers who worked themselves into subsequent investigations like the FEMA report, which finally had $600,000 worth of funding, but their efforts were quite hampered. According to the New York Times, they couldn't get access to the site, the blueprints of the buildings, the steel, appealing to the public for photos and so forth. NIST took over the investigation from FEMA, who basically called it a pancaking collapse. NIST took another 3 years and had $20 million worth of funding. NIST is part of the U.S. branch of government under the Department of Commerce, so it's not an independent analysis whatsoever. Their theory? Well, column failure. Nearly all the columns failed at once on the outside of the perimeter of this building, perimeter structural steel frame. And that was due, they said, to the massive fires at the time of the collapse, causing the floor trusses to sag. When they sagged, they pulled in the columns. The problem is that sagging floor trusses don't cause can't cause the pulling in on these 14-inch square steel tube columns. So NIST, in their computer model, imposed an artificial 5,000-pound load on the perimeter structure to get them to fail. So this is to get them to fail in their computer model. This is fraud, essentially. Because a catenary arch doesn't impose that amount of load on columns, and particularly all the way around the building. And the fires were gone, quite diminished by the time of the collapse. So they were thick black smoke, indicating that these were oxygen-starved and cooler fires. So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. We have a question, the scientific method's been used in the West for 100 years or so. It's not too difficult. It's a simple set of conceptual processes. What caused the towers to collapse? We do some background research, make observations, construct our best hypothesis, our best guess, how the towers collapsed. Maybe the planes brought them down. That's a reasonable and those explosions of jet fuel, maybe the ensuing fires. All these hypotheses should be evaluated, particularly the hypothesis of explosions, for which we're going to be looking at an awful lot of evidence today. That and the hypothesis of controlled demolition are reasonable, given the evidence you're going to be seeing today and next week in this 3-part series. We test those hypotheses with experiments after making predictions about them. We analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're about. And we don't hide the input data, for instance, as NIST has told us that they couldn't give us because it might jeopardize public safety if we were to give you, architects and engineers who design high-rise buildings, the data that we used to determine how these buildings came down. We talked about that last week in part 1 of this series. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we will see today, the NIST hypothesis was not, we go back, we construct a new hypothesis until we find one that is supported by the evidence, the experiments, the research, and so forth. So with that in mind, let's do some preliminary research, find out what are some of the forces that have destroyed high-rise buildings. Fire is certainly one of them, not high-rises, but because we haven't lost a high-rise prior to 9/11 due to fire, but it's an organic and chaotic process. And in modern high-rises, it burns through an area, a given area, in roughly 20 or maybe 30 minutes. In fact, NIST acknowledges this, that the fires didn't persist at any one location for more than about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. But we'll see that they completely contradict this, claiming that the fires were extremely hot at the time of the collapse, which was 90 minutes, more than 90 minutes after the collapse of the North Tower. So we haven't lost a skyscraper, but in wood frame buildings, we'd expect that building to fall over if it was going to fall at all. Not straight down through the path of the tons of supporting structure underneath that's not even on fire, but it might fall over. What about steel frame buildings? Well, they built an 8-story steel frame building just to see what would happen when they put 2,000-degree fires on it, fueled by incredible fuel loads, trying to get those temperatures up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. They set it on fire, and by the way, it had some of the steel beams were fireproofed, some of them were not. And let's see what happened.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, we're referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse in one day due to uncontrolled fires, as we're told. So this is getting really important. The summary of this incredible report says it's inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. So the connections don't fail. This is extremely important. As we saw last week, the connections in NIST's computer model failed at a rate of 400 per second. The beams might sag when they reach the 1200-degree critical temperature. But there's a history of much hotter, larger, and longer-lasting fires in these structures. Let's take a look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
So, even after 9/11, we have several fully engulfed high-rises that have not collapsed. Very important precedents. So what happened on 9/11? These fires brought this building down in a manner in which we're going to be looking at today, fast. You can see why architects and engineers are taking a second look at this, at least. And here's some natural collapses, in this case, earthquakes. These buildings fall over to the path of least resistance. That's what we might expect in a natural collapse. The law of entropy, increasing chaos, it falls over. But the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, as we'll see happens at the Twin Towers. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete expanding at an incredibly rapid rate in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the intense heat from the explosives. There's a solid edge on the outside. This is due to the rapid expansion. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. So we'll be looking for those features at the World Trade Center. And some of these features as well, because we can harness explosives quite effectively to bring down high-rise. In fact, this is the method used to bring down high-rises almost universally. So we have a set of features associated with the phenomena or techniques of controlled demolition. But you see, they can bring it down pretty much in any way they want if things go well. What are those features? We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually near the base of the structure, but as you'll see today, not always. We have a straight down, nearly symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint because there's a patterned removal of column supports that facilitates that. And feature number 4, a near freefall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel framework underneath, resulting also in the total dismemberment of the structural columns and beams, one from another, and limited damage to adjacent structures. That's at least the idea of a controlled demolition. Very different in the case of the Twin Towers because it's very much more explosive demolition. Feature number 7, patterned explosions heard by witnesses, lots of them, as you'll see. Flashes of light. Broken up concrete floors, of course. You don't want to have to go back in and jackhammer these floors in a typical controlled demolition. And typically, there are explosive charges visible at many of the floors. We'll be looking for those in the Twin Towers, as well as chemical evidence left behind from the explosives. So all of this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of it is created by fire, let alone all of these 10 features. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. Why have we not lost a high-rise due to fire? Typically, because, well, the steel, one reason is the steel is an incredible heat sink. It conducts that heat away from the source, keeping it from achieving its 1200 degree critical temperature, 1200 Fahrenheit, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. We don't want that to happen. So we put fireproofing also, just to make sure. 2 and 3 hour fire protection on the beams and the columns. That's 6 times more fire protection than needed for the 20 or 30 minutes of fire that NIST acknowledges. Even they acknowledge that fires only last that long in modern skyscrapers. So 2 to 3 hour fire protection should be plenty. Non-combustible buildings is what they build these out of too. That helps a lot, right? And fuel loads are kept low by the tenants occupying these buildings. And just to keep all that from ever becoming a problem with fire, we put fire sprinklers in these buildings. Now, the fire sprinklers were said to have been compromised when the planes impacted the buildings, at least above the point of the jet plane impacts. So with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, that can be very helpful. Foreknowledge. You don't just bring down a skyscraper in an afternoon. It takes months of planning and preparation and dozens of explosive loaders, so people know about it. Afterwards, experts will agree, hey, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. With video documentation, of course, all this can be proof of controlled demolition, proof which we're going to go ahead and apply toward the destruction of the Twin Towers. Looking at those features, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the point of jet plane impacts? Not at the base of the towers, like we saw with respect to World Trade Center 7, but in these deceptive controlled demolitions, it's a magic show. We're being asked to look at the jet planes as the cause, and the impacts and the fires as the cause of the collapse. So that's where we need to look even more closely today, as we're going to do. So you don't have to start these explosions, if you will, at the base of the tower. We'll take a look at that. But here's the North Tower, straight down. Suddenly, it's one moment it's standing there, the next moment it's in motion, uniform motion. No sagging, no hesitation, no jolt at what we're told are impacting floors and columns. We don't see that though. South Tower, same thing. It's standing still, and all of a sudden, without jolting or impacting, that South Tower is in motion. Now, we would expect something else, given what we know about steel columns, that even when they buckle, they still have resistance. The resistance never goes to zero. In this case, 25% minimum resistance is reached. So free fall acceleration is not possible during this buckling. And yet we have darn near free fall, and it shouldn't be possible. We'll go into that. Feature number 2, are there patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Well, the oral histories show that the first responders talked exactly about that. Their testimonies were taken in October and September to preserve those accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory for the city fire commissioner. So of the 500 recordings, which were finally ordered released not until August of 2005 by the New York Court State of Appeals that forced the city of New York to release these to the New York Times. What did the New York Times find and publish in terms of the transcripts? 12,000 pages of transcripts gone through very carefully by Professor Graham McQueen in Canada. What did he find? Initially, 118, subsequently many, many more. Firefighters observing sounds of explosions, seeing flashes of light, and other phenomena of explosive demolition. Let's look at a few of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, with respect to these testimonies, you're going to hear the order of events. They're seeing this phenomena. They're feeling this phenomena. They're hearing this phenomena. And then the towers come down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top. Simultaneously, from all four sides, material shot out, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, it seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's look at the North Tower on the right and a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Sudden onset of destruction, smooth descent. Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since fire, the official cause of these buildings' collapses, has never brought down a skyscraper in the history of skyscrapers? Should it not have been the first hypothesis they evaluated, controlled demolition? If not the only relevant one, since all the evidence seems to point in that direction, as you're already beginning to see in this 3-part series. Nope, but it was relegated to a frequently asked question posted years later on their website. Why didn't NIST consider a controlled demolition hypothesis? Well, they write back with what we call an argument by appealing to authority. We interviewed 200 experts, 125 leading experts, interviewed more than 1,000 people, 7,000 photographs, analyzed 236 pieces of steel. Well, they say we don't support the controlled demolition hypothesis. And video evidence showed unambiguously that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. Therefore, it couldn't be a controlled demolition, right? If it does, that's what controlled most of them do, but not all, as you'll see. This found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting the towers were brought down by controlled demolition using explosives. Well, we'll find out later how hard they actually looked for evidence for that hypothesis. Back to the witnesses, though. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors And then you hear a pop, pop, pop. When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building. That building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash that came out of the building. Then it would just go all the way around the building on both sides. Let's take a look at the South Tower on the right, in comparison to a known controlled demolition on the left. Again, is there any similarity? Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Slowing it down halfway. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions which appear to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. I'm not reading all 125, now 156 of these testimonies. You can read the rest of them. Did you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think, at that point still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when the buildings exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. And these additional witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now waiting to bring on all of us. It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, that we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's the One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Are these credible witnesses? If so, how many of them do you imagine were included in the draft or final reports of NIST? Not one. Zero. They claim to have interviewed thousands of witnesses. They missed every one of these, though. NIST says, well, it couldn't have been a top-down controlled demolition. I mean, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom, which they typically do, as you saw in normal controlled demolitions. Well, let's listen to Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc. on this subject.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
And here's a top-down controlled demolition. NIST says, well, the top part drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Well, wait a minute. There's a law here, Newton's third law of equal and opposite destruction. When you run two bodies into each other, there's equal and opposite destruction. Does it matter if we drop the lighter one onto the heavier one? No. The lightest part of a structure, and these are virtual pyramids, because you need all the weight in the bottom to support the building. And no, the lightest part of a structure can't possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel below. At the top, you might have 3/8 inch thick structural steel columns, and then as you go down, they get heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier. At mid-height, 2 inches thick and 32 inches by 16 inches. And if you go and down at the bottom, they're virtually solid steel. So, no, the top part can't destroy. But this is a theory that came from Zdenek Bazant of Chicago Northwestern University, a structural engineer, who submitted this paper, a very, very complex paper, submitted just 2 days after 9/11. It's called his crush down, crush up theory. Everybody else is in shock, trying to figure out what's happening to our country and to New York and DC. And here this guy's just cranking away calculations that must have taken him a whole lot longer than 2 days anyway. But that's speculation on my part. His formulas are correct, but the input data is false. Let's look at it. There's 6 key errors. One is obfuscation. You can't decode it, although there's been structural engineers who have, and we're going to be looking at their work. Second, they completely eliminate an entire story of columns at the point of jet plane impact, as if all those columns were damaged at once. We know that's not the case, because NIST just says a few of them were damaged. But in order to get a false dynamic load, they simply vanish. 280 columns. They double the mass of the section of building up above. They decrease this column strength below by 3 times. And they decrease the velocity loss. That would be due to the conservation of the law of momentum. So, and then they, on top of that, they eliminate the column reserve strength. These columns are 3 times stronger than they ever need to be. So with all that, we have the results of these errors rigged 12 to 1 in favor of a collapse, at a minimum 12 to 1. It's much more than that, actually. So they force the building to collapse in his 4-page paper. So this is fraud. And this fraud is actually countered by the actual measured data. Well, the measured data shows that it comes down nearly at free fall, which Besant also was trying to support. But in reality, if you didn't have controlled demolition, Chandler's calculations show that the downward movement would have been arrested after 2 seconds in a natural collapse. And so we have time on the bottom, velocity on the top. The velocity stops after 2 seconds. If there was, even if there was an initial impact. So these key errors are refuted in peer-reviewed papers that submitted to peer-reviewed papers by Tony Zambotti and Richard Johns, and in the American Society of Civil Engineers. And this paper by Gregory Zudolinski, Richard Johns, Tony Zambotti in 2013. But the errors in Besant's original paper were upheld. They will not publish these additional papers. Why? They say that it's out of scope. Well, how is it out of scope for one group of engineers to submit and expose the errors of another group that was already published? That's what you do in peer reviewed. So this is fraud, and it is being challenged today with an ethics complaint. We can't get into that. So now, looking at the upper section here, we actually see with our own eyes that it's not destroying the lower section. Take a look at this way. Look at the red line on the bottom. It doesn't go down until maybe after 3 seconds. The upper part is being destroyed. The question is, what's destroying it? So it's like the Volkswagen running into the Mack truck, but only it's not just the Mack truck that's destroying it. There's some other process at work, which you can see also more clearly in this video. Start, stop. We have bands of explosions, just like the firefighters described, wrapping all the way around the building. Continue. And we note that NIST's theory is based on their observation of the inward bowing of these columns. They claim that that was caused by sagging floor trusses due to hot fires at the time of the collapse. But while we see these inward bowing exterior columns in this video in the corners again and again and again, here and over here, in this looped video, what we don't really know from looking at this is what's causing those, until we start to look at some other evidence that FEMA actually came up with before NIST took over the investigation from them in 2002. Let's see what they're discovering.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
The core columns let go first because the antenna, which you can see here in forward to back, back to forward to back to, looking at the top edge of the picture, you can verify FEMA's assertion here that it's falling first, probably 10 to 20 feet. This is a 400-foot tall antenna. It's massive. Well, what does the antenna sit on? The antenna sits on the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? The hat truss sits on the core columns. Oh, hold on a second. There we go. So something's happening to the core columns that causes the hat truss to descend before the perimeter columns descend or bow in inwardly. So the core columns are pulling on the floor trusses, and then the floor trusses are pulling on the perimeter columns, like you kind of see here in this not so accurately put together animation from, I think, Nova. But the concept is still there, that the core columns descend and then pull on the floor trusses, which are pulling on the perimeter structure. And nowhere in any of the photographs or videos do we see a pile driver, an upper section that, like we're told by NIST and Zdenek Bazant, driving the rest of the building down to the ground. As we already saw, it's being destroyed in the first 3 seconds. And if it were there, it would have destroyed these interior core columns that remain just, oops, let's see if we can get that video. There we go. That remain about 6 seconds after the rest of the building is destroyed. That upper section would have crushed these interior core columns that remain and then descend. So what are we looking at here? It looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with upward, outward arching streamers. The geometry of fireworks. Freely flying solid objects followed by thick white smoke clouds, which we'll come to in part 3 of this series. Oh, cute. So, does it look anything like a gravitational collapse to you? After you put on a different lens, look at it through a different pair of glasses. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse? Hold on one second. I'm going to resync my PowerPoint here. Here we go. And let's take a look at the South Tower's destruction. It begins to actually fall over. Actually, it's falling at about 22 degrees. So it's falling off of its axis on the building below. So we have asymmetrical loading from this portion of the tower. We have asymmetrical damage from the plane on the columns up above. We have asymmetrical damage from the fire. So how in the world do we get complete symmetrical damage all the way down the face of the building, given the asymmetrical phenomena up above? Just like the fireman described, like a belt wrapping all the way around the building. Well, let's zoom in to one part of this lower corner of the building. What are we looking at? A gravitational collapse or a series of explosions rapidly descending ahead of the complete destruction of this building? And watch this one. And what's causing that? So you can see this from another perspective. Racing down the corner of the building, ahead of the destruction, almost as fast traveling as the freely falling debris below. And we'll show you how fast it's coming down. This is a 1,200 foot diameter debris circle around this building. The towers are only 207 foot wide, and yet up to 1,400 feet actually in diameter around, well outside the perimeter of ground zero, completely destroying the winter gardens from the World Financial Center, 600 feet away, and well outside the perimeter of the structure, as you see outlined here. The steel frame is completely broken up as well. Compare that to the nice, neat pile that we looked at last week in this three-part series. Building 7, a classic implosion. Very neat, if you will. Nice, neat pile. But the debris field of the Twin Towers is 20 times the area of the footprint of the towers, indicating a very explosive destruction. By the way, if 100,000 tons of steel is distributed outside the footprint, and I mean 600 feet outside the footprint, 300 to 600 feet, then we have to ask ourselves, what's crushing the building? This is a third of the weight of the building. You say, oh, well, it must be the concrete floors. We'll come back to that. What's happening during the destruction with the ejection of these explosive phenomena, these squibs or isolated explosive ejections? They're occurring here and here, 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the destruction up above, completely unexplainable. NIST says, well, these must be puffs of air produced by that pile driver up above. That the air's got to come down the elevator hoistway and come out somewhere, right? Well, these aren't puffs of air. These are building solids. You can see them very, very clearly. Also, if the open office space, if it was puffs, air pressure being delivered, it would come out in the open office planning and blow out all those windows as the air pressure equalized, or blow out none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections occurring at what appear to be engineered locations. And in the case of the South Tower on the upper left, we have dozens of squibs all at once, indicating the uniform destruction, simultaneous destruction of the structure inside this building. There's no fires up here. Fires are down here. And we have the squibs being analyzed by physics teacher David Chandler. Let's listen.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
(160 to 200 feet per second. These are not puffs of air by air pressure. These are explosive speeds. And how fast is the building coming down? Well, let's take a look. We can time it on the left and look at an animation on the right. Here's 5 seconds. Here's 8 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, the entire building is shattered from top to bottom. How fast is this? Let's go back to physics teacher David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
Well, what's it falling down through? It's falling down through this. 90,000 tons of structural steel in each of these buildings. More steel on the face of this building than glass at near free fall acceleration, as if it weren't even there. Let's look at it this way. On the left, well, on the right, we have 15 stories of structural steel identical to the steel in the Twin Towers. Steel frame building, part of a building. On the left, we have the same exact structure, and we put it over, say, 70,000 tons of structural steel, just like the towers. And we'll even give a dynamic load. We'll vanish those columns like Zdenek Bezant did in that story to give it an impact. We let go with these giant cranes at the same time. What happens? Well, this is 7th grade physics. This can be figured out very intuitively. The structure on the right is going to fall at free fall acceleration. The structure on the left is going to impact and slow down. But that's not what happened. It didn't slow down on 9/11. It went faster and faster and faster straight down through all of that structure. Here's another way to look at it from Massimo Mazzucco's September 11th, New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and this is why we did succeed in getting one of the third peer-reviewed paper published in the Journal of Protective Structures by Gregory Zidlinsky, Anthony Zambodi, and Richard Johns. So that was not the American Society of Civil Engineers. So let's look at the structural steel frame and what happened to it, because the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigations is the leading authority on the subject for these investigations. And they say, look for shrapnel effects under effects of explosions, characterized with high order damage, the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances, which is exactly what we have in the Twin Towers. So it should have been a clue to NIST to examine explosive demolition here. It's shattered into its 37.5-foot lengths, these columns ready for loading and shipment. How about lateral ejection? A really important topic also, because the NFPA 921 investigation guide says look for blast pressure wave effects. Heavy structural steel pieces and sections freely flying, they say, which is exactly what we have. Freely flying structural steel sections landing 300 to 600 feet in every direction. Like this one here particularly, whoa, back to, forward to, back to, forward. That's 45 degrees. Now, how does gravity work? Down. What's happening here? This material, this 4-ton structural steel section, is shot out like the other hundreds of structural steel sections, lateral, and then gravity takes over and it begins to achieve a 45-degree vector, as you see here, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Structural steel is not flammable. We'll go into what that might be, or clearly the evidence shows it to be, in part 3 of this series next week. In the meantime, let's look at the physics of these lateral ejections from physics teacher David Chandler.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds. I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
This is enough energy to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. And there are hundreds of these sections that have been hurled. So let's look at the concrete. We have 110 floors, each an acre in size, 4-inch thick and 8-inch thick concrete. But we don't see 50 of them. We don't see 10 of them. We don't see one of them in the photos available to us in the aftermath of the destruction here. On the right, we have a real gravitational collapse in Mexico. We see pancakes. Where's the concrete floors? It's missing. They are missing. Oh, here it is. 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized in midair. All the photographs and videos show exactly these incredible pulverized clouds, pulverized to 100 micron particles, as the dust studies show from the U.S. Geological Survey, covering downtown Manhattan with a blanket of 3 and 4-inch thick dust. Studies show 30% of this powder is pulverized concrete, spread over a 3 square mile area. Let's listen to the governor.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
what I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were if 90,000 tons of concrete was pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, what percentage of that concrete was available to crush the building? Like 0.001%, maybe 1%. So the steel wasn't crushing the building. The concrete's not crushing the building. Together, this is 2/3 the weight of the building. What's left to crush the building? Think about it. We had maybe 10,000 metal filing cabinets, but they could only find one. It survived because it was in the basement. It's from an ice cream store. Incredible degree of pulverization. Speaking of which, what happened to the victims? We're going to find out when we restart. So hang on with me 1 second. We're going to start right from where we were. The story of the victims, of course, was the most tragic of all. But we're going to delve into the details, which is really necessary. Here, let's do that.
In April 2000.
Hold on 1 second. And that, here we go.
New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments.
Hey, it stops.
Human remains from 9/11 had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Small indeed, a half an inch long, 700 of them found on top of the Deutsche Bank building. Oh gosh. There we go. Over here, well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because it sent its ejections out the other side of World Trade Center 2. It didn't come from the people in this airplane because those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by World Trade Center 2. And many of them were from firefighters. As you can see by the distribution of the red triangles indicating firefighter remains. The firefighters weren't on the scene, of course, at the time of the impacts, so it wasn't from people in the planes or the firefighters. There was 2,749 victims, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces of bodies found. 6,000 of them were small enough to fit into a test tube. And yet, 200 pieces matched to a single person. And 1,151 victims remain completely unaccounted for? How is that even possible? They were vaporized. Oh, great. My PowerPoint is acting up. So the distribution of WTC victims with the tracking database finds that these body parts were spread 800 feet outside the World Trade Center towers. You might expect that these bodies would be mangled, certainly, and found trapped between floors. What pulverization phenomena was at work that could be caused by gravitational collapse? No. And the distribution of these parts? No. What we've been looking at is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. The fires cause structures to fall asymmetrically, gradually, but not even in no precedent in high-rise steel frame office buildings, especially fires like these, which were diminished severely at the time of the collapse, indicated by the oxygens, that they're oxygen starved, indicated by the thick black smoke. So, with testimony of the first responders, we now have 156 after a more careful review of those that were citing evidence of explosions. This review by author Graham McQueen. And another victim, another witness to this set of tragic events was the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Hang on one second. We're going to just redo our PowerPoint once more. See if we can get it synced up. It's driving me nuts. There we go. So we have 20 miles north, this observatory picking up seismic waves at the time of the plane impacts. Okay, so NIST says, well, these are due to the plane impacts. That must be, because there's a 0.9 magnitude event in the case of the North Tower. In the case of the South Tower, it's a 0.7 magnitude event. Well, let's look at it more carefully. In the North Tower, we have the seismic event at 8:46 and 26 seconds. But the plane doesn't arrive until 14 seconds later. So how can the plane be causing the event 14 seconds earlier? This is per the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board radar that the 9/11 Commission relied on. It's accurate to within a second. So what is NIST going to do with this discrepancy? Well, they say, we looked at the videos and we think the plane arrived 10 seconds earlier than the NTSB radar. Okay. You're still 4 seconds off. What are you going to do with that? Well, they went to Columbia University and got them to move their data back 3 seconds, which put them in the ballpark. What kind of science is this? Hey, the same thing happens at the South Tower. The seismic event occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds, but the planes don't impact until 17 seconds later. This says, oops, we looked at the videos and we don't think the plane impacted then. We think it impacted 12 seconds earlier. Okay, you're still 5 seconds off. What are you going to do? Go back to Lamont Doherty and get them to move this set of data back 3 seconds also, which they say puts them in the ballpark. We don't get the report from Columbia University, which says it was produced, but it's private, privately contracted between NIST and Columbia University. No reasons given as to why these data sets are moved back. Well, what could be a possible reason for these earlier events Let's go to Mike Picoro. So the whole building seemed to shake. There was a loud explosion in the basement. When they got to the sea level, they found the machine shop gone. Nothing there but rubble. Talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press, gone. The two made their way to the parking garage, found that it too was gone. No walls. There was rubble on the floor. Couldn't see anything. The steel and concrete door weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil lying on the floor. A bomb had gone off in the building, in the basement, which is not a part of the official story. And neither is this. Witnesses of bombs in the building before the plane impacts. Take a look. Come on, William's going to give us.
Was the janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane. And then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
So bombs going off in the lobby and the basement before the planes actually hitting. This is
was a janitor.
Was very important. Well, we go to Andre Rousseau, applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. What does he say? Well, let's look at the frequency of these Raleigh waves, these main seismic waves. They're on the order of only 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. But aircraft crash impacts have higher frequencies, 10 hertz or 100 hertz. This is according to available data. And those frequencies weren't even measurable by the equipment used by Lamont Doherty. He says the range of the instruments doesn't even allow for recording such waves. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz. So, he says the seismic signals are not from the plane impacts. The actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened before hitting the ground, even. This is like a flagpole. You know, it's flexible up top. The building swayed after it was impacted. So let's go to the building collapse itself, the first collapse. Because there were seismic events, in this case, 2.1 magnitude earthquake at the South Tower, which the official story claims was due to the debris hitting the ground. And we have a 2.3 magnitude earthquake at the North Tower, again, attributed to the debris hitting the ground. But slow down, let's take a look. The surface waves arrive at 10:28 and 31 seconds from the North Tower. But the tower starts its descent 9 seconds earlier, and the first debris doesn't even strike the pavement until 1 second later, and the heaviest debris striking another 4 seconds later. So how can the building hitting the ground cause the event? Well, NIST has an answer to that. We looked at the videos and we think, in this case, they contract yet again a third time with Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, finding that the seismic waves, getting them to move their data back 3 seconds. So that's a real problem. Another problem is that the well-defined P and S waves are ignored by Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and by NIST. They're well defined here. Primary waves and shear waves. These are the Raleigh waves. That's what everybody's looking at. And they're choosing to ignore these very well-defined waves, which arrive earlier. And in fact, so let's look and see what might be causing these 6 seconds earlier and 10 seconds earlier. Remember the witnesses of explosions before the tower came down? Well, here's another witness. It's a camera on a tripod. It shakes 6 seconds before the collapse. Something shaking that tripod. Let's take a look. So we're still, and there's the big shake on the tripod. I'm not shaking this camera. It shook. And then we have a big explosion on the top, and then the building comes down 6 seconds after the shake. And again, we have, another camera from Etienne Soret on the North Tower shaking 10 seconds before. So the camera is set up on the roof of an adjacent building with a great view. And here's the shake. And there's the explosions on top. And then the building comes down at the 10-second mark after the shake. So that's really important. So let's look at the numbers here. In the case of the South Tower, we have the start of the seismic event at 9:59 and 04 seconds. Now the start of the tower collapse, even per NIST, is 5 seconds earlier. And then, but the first debris doesn't hit the ground until 7 seconds after the start of the seismic event. So how is NIST going to explain this one? Once again, they go back to Lamont Doherty or Columbia University, get them to move their data back 3 seconds. Again, none of these reports we get access to. So you can't do freedom of information requests from non-governmental entities like universities, or we would do that. So what happens in this case? What can explain that? Well, 3 seconds prior to the start of the tower collapse, we have yet another camera on another tripod shaking, showing what happened there. Let's look at that one. This one's more subtle. New York TV station 1, New York 1. And here we go and watch carefully. There's the shake. 3 seconds later, and the collapse begins. So you can check this work out, the excellent work of author Graham McQueen. So it's claimed that the debris is hitting the ground causing the shaking, but let's look at this. The concrete floors are not even hitting the ground, right? They've been turned to powder, pulverized dust, spread over a 3 square miles. So there's no contribution to seismic event from the concrete powder. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, 4 to 8 tons each, peppering the ground over 15 seconds. Not even the ground, but the top of a concrete slab, which is the plaza or the top of the parking structure. And it's equally distributed over the entire World Trade Center superblock and beyond. So there's no seismic component from those elements. In addition to this, look, we have 2 identical collapses from nearly identical buildings. But one of them is producing a seismic strength 1.6 times greater. 2.1 on the magnitude versus 2.3 due to the logarithmic scale of these, the Richter scale. 1.6 times greater in the North Tower. So how can that even be explained? Andre Rousseau says, identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude. That makes sense. Well, you can review this seismic evidence also at the Consensus 9/11 panel put out by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin, professor uh, who documented very carefully in point TT7. Why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. And by the way, some people in error try to compare the Twin Towers to the Seattle Kingdom. This is apples and oranges. Seattle Kingdom is a 25,000-ton concrete roof which impacts the ground virtually at once. So versus the peppering that we just talked about and the lack of chunks of concrete. So do your homework too. I don't just believe everything we're saying. Take a look at this incredible work that's been done before you, before us. The work that we stand on. How about the FEMA and NIST reports? The NIST report was cited to be the ultimate investigation ever. They had $20 million of funding, which, by the way, was far less than the effort to determine the source of the stains on Monica Lewinsky's dress. But they were tasked by Congress to explain how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, and why and how World Trade Center 7 collapsed, which we looked at last week. But their objective was different than what Congress had tasked them with. It was hidden on footnote 13 on page 82. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. Wait, what was the task? The task was to explain how World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. What did they do? They stopped at the initiation of collapse. They explain, although it doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions of collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. 10,000 pages, $20 million of our money, and you have only a half page trying to explain the actual collapse? Well, what does it say? Structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through the energy of deformation. Came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. They have a lot more questions here than answers, a lot more speculation than analysis. It's a pre-collapse report. It should have been titled Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse of the World Trade Center. So we submitted a request for correction, which you can do under the Data Quality Act. Challenge faulty reports from governmental agencies. And they write back, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Yeah, or any analysis whatsoever. They did say, NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Oh, well, they admit a year later in writing that NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You won't find what you won't look for. What do the experts say? At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinions in the matter. William Rice, the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer, near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer, signed on to the petition again. with AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. Dan Romero, Director of Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center at New Mexico Tech. Explosive devices caused the collapse of the Twin Towers. Too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were explosive devices inside the building that caused the towers to collapse. Of course, he withdrew this testimony after becoming aware that the official story was very different, and that his federal grants for New Mexico Tech were reliant upon consistency with that official story, probably. Like Mathis Levy did before he was aware of the official story.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
And Ronald Hamburger, who before becoming part of the FEMA team said, "It appeared to me that charge has been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised." Well, we've seen all kinds of evidence that bombs have been detonated. Apparently he was told what the story was, and he became a part of the FEMA team. Mike Taylor, Executive Director, National Association Demolition Contractors. The collapse of the Twin Towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. Andre Rousseau, whom we just heard from, even if the plane's impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles away, and should have been very similar in the two cases to one another, but they were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. What about the evidence? Surely it was preserved in what were the two most puzzling structural failures in history. This Abulhassan Astani Azal, structural engineer that had unlimited access to the structural steel at the landfill through a National Science Foundation grant.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
Too little, too late. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, "Crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China," showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't, of course, and easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads per day carting this material out of World Trade Center and taking it to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Well, altogether today, so far, in part 2 of this series, if we using the scientific method, what is your judgment about what caused the Twin Towers to collapse? What's the hypothesis that makes the most sense to you? That's what we want to know about. Have we shown direct evidence of destruction with explosives? with the first 8 characteristics and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition here? Have we shown direct evidence of destruction with explosives? Have we shown that no fire cannot cause these features? Have we shown additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, proof of controlled demolition? That's what we want you to let us know and ask your questions to. Andy, how do they do just that?
Okay, at this time, please submit your questions in the same input form we talked about before. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education and find the live webinars. You'll see a box to type your questions in, and we will do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you, Andy. And right there, as Andy mentioned, and while you're there, subscribe to our newsletter. It comes out every couple of weeks. There's all kinds of information there, the latest evidence that we're gathering, the latest efforts and success we're having toward getting a real investigation. And we have the things you can do while you're there on the website, get informed, incredible quantities and qualities of other evidence, that's videos and all kinds of things. And sign the petition especially if you're an architect or engineer. We have 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. You can support them as one of 20,000 others as well. And donate to us. We are doing this only on donations. These are by and large small donations, $10 here and there. And you can do that here on our website quite easily. We're all around the country giving presentations, mailing out evidence to architects and engineers of all kinds, educating the media, educating Congress. We have lots and lots of work to do. So we rely on the sustaining members. Join the family of sustaining supporters. If you can, for cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can make a huge difference because there's 1,000 of you giving at the $5 level, and you do that for us, and you'll be doing your part to support us. If you can't do that, please volunteer. Andy, what are some of the ways people can help there?
That's right. Especially if you're stuck at home now because of the pandemic, it's a great time to reach out and do some 9/11 activism, and you can do that with us. Richard will talk about some of the ways you can do it by yourself, but if you want to be a part of a team, do volunteer. Go to ae911truth.org. There's a very short form that you can fill out, and we'll get in touch with you and see where you will best fit. But there's any number of things you can do depending on your personality. If you like to talk to people and be up front, we can put you on a phone team, call people, and relay our message to them, get them to look at the World Trade Center 7 study. We got to find who those people are first, too. So if you're not somebody that likes to talk on the phone, you can do that research and find those people for us. And of course, there's other things, very specialized things, translations, verifications team, web team. Good place for many people to fit. So please, if you're considering volunteering, do it, and you'll be part of something special.
Yeah, you will. And there's things you can do in your home, at home too. Like Andy mentioned, contact your elected representatives. Hey, get a meeting going with them. Tell them about the request for correction, which I'll show you, and make an appointment. We will be there to give the meeting over the phone with you. We'll bring one of our engineers and myself also. So make that appointment. Andy will show you how to do that. In fact, let's make another slide just about that. We're going to continue to do that, aren't we, Andy? That program where people make appointments.
Absolutely. Even beyond the request for correction, it's always a good time to talk to your congressman about 9/11. I'll actually tell everyone how to do that right now if you want.
I'll make a note to make a new slide too.
Definitely, yeah, because it's something that I've been working into the Bobby McIlvain slide, but it's kind of a separate thing. So we have this request for correction going on with NIST right now. We want Congress members to know about it. We want them to be involved and let NIST know that they are watching, and that is our ask when we go into these offices. We don't physically go into them because of the pandemic. A lot of members of Congress are taking these meetings over the phone, or their staffers are. And what we just need our supporters to do is get the ball rolling, because to them, we're just a couple of guys from Berkeley. We're not constituents. They want to hear from constituents initially. So you make that first request. Let us know that you did it. Congress at ae911truth.org. Just say, hey, Andy, I contacted my congressman. This is his name. We'll see what happens. There's instructions right on the website on what to put in. So we've done most of the work for you. And then we can actually pick it up for you, because I always love writing to them and following up and saying, hey, your constituent made this meeting request. Is this going to happen? I say it a little bit more polite than that, but but basically, yeah, we can help you. We just need you to take that first step for us. So again, contact your congressman, go to our website. We actually have a news item that tells you what to do, and then let us know, Congress at ae911truth.org. And if I need more info from you, I'll write back and ask you. So that's how you do it.
Perfect. That email again is Congress at ae911truth.org. So tell everybody you know about the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and our mission. Your elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers, screen the DVDs, which you can get, or just show the YouTube videos, which are free. But share them. The brochures are $10 for 100 of them. Share them one-on-one with special people. Tell them about the World Trade Center 7 evaluation, which Professor Halsey has done an extraordinary 4-year analysis of Building 7 and concluded that the building could not come down by fire, as NIST claims. So it's all there. And we want you to get this information out for us. The 137-page report, you can walk it to a structural engineer and say, have you seen this? This is incredible. It's a 47-story skyscraper. According to the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, did not come down by fire. So we have a request for correction submitted to NIST. And it highlights the key problems that they had with their report on Building 7, which is buttressed by the Leroy Halsey study, and points out all the fraud, not all of it, but the key points of fraud. I mean, we'd be here all day naming all the fraud that NIST has committed here. We're taking that to Congress. How do we do that, Andy?
That's right. This is the Bobby McIlvain World Trade Center Investigation Act. If you're not aware of it already, it's named after Bobby McIlvain, who died entering the North Tower on the morning of September 11th. He was actually killed by an explosion right there in the lobby, which immediately calls into question the official story that we've been given. So we've named the act after him. His father, Bob, has worked with us for years. And what it would do, as it says here, is it would establish a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress. That would look into the evidence that Richard has been going over tirelessly since, 2007, 2008, when the organization was founded. But it would do more than just have NIST come out and give Congress a bunch of talking points. It's actually written in the legislation that they have to look into controlled demolition and the hypothesis that Richard has put forth. So how do you get involved? Well, very simple. You let your congressman know that you want them to support this. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can call them on the phone and say that you support the Bobby McIlvain Act and that they should as well. You can also go to ae911truth.org/justice. You can download a packet that has the act in it, along with some letters from Bob McIlvain and Richard. Next time your congressman is not afraid to face you in these current times, you go and hand it to them, or you can email it to them as well, put it into a PDF attachment and email it to them. If you don't have time for all of that, you can very simply put your address and your zip code, and there's a letter that's automatically generated for you. You just got to put that info in, and it will send it right to your congressman's office. You get a chance to read it too before you send it. So you got to get involved, because these politicians don't do anything unless they're afraid of something else. And the afraid of something else in this case is not getting elected again. So you do it and get all of your other activist friends in your area to do it as well.
Right on. And I'll just tell you guys, we've submitted 60 exhibits of our evidence, some of which you've seen today, to the U.S. Attorney in a petition for a grand jury investigation. And we filed a mandamus lawsuit now to ensure that it happens. So we're awaiting the results of the judge's orders on that mandamus lawsuit. So we're going to get information here about it soon, and also on the FBI lawsuit, because they were supposed to provide our evidence to Congress per the 2015 review 9/11 Review Commission, and they did not provide it. They had it, and they had the nanothermite paper, which we're going to talk about next week. They had our full lecture, as you've been hearing it today, and they even acknowledged having those. So that lawsuit forces them to give it to Congress, which makes it public. So stand by for results of that as well. And just know that you need to be seeing also our landmark documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out, in which we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence that you've been seeing and you're going to see next week in part 3 of this series. I'll give you just a couple of minutes of look at it.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. I think, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we ask them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yep, it's important and it's good. You can get it for free on YouTube, the 1 hour version or the 90-minute version in our store at ae911truth.org is available along with an extended set of interviews with Meet the Experts. Really, really good information. The 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, challenges the NIST report in writing, and there you can download that for free at beyondmisinformation.org, or get the coffee table version from our store online also. And then our classic lectures, 2 hours, that's free on YouTube, and also is the 15-minute documentary on Building 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner. So I encourage you to look at that too. You can get the video at our store too if you want the DVD. Hey, I think we got some questions, right, Andy?
Yep, we have 4 questions today. The first one asks, in FAQ number 11, NIST says the Twin Towers were designed to support only the static weight of the floors above and not any dynamic effects due to the downward momentum. I was under the impression that a safety factor of 3 to 5 meant each floor was designed to support at least 3 times the static weight of the floors above, and not just 1 times the static weight, as NIST seems to indicate in their answer to question 11. Was I wrong?
Well, NIST can squeeze out of this in the following manner. Well, first of all, the structural engineers make their buildings 3 times stronger at a minimum than they need to be. If they were only designed to support the static weight of the floor, so NIST is wrong here, then you get more than the static weight of the floor, which is applied to it by some other combination of forces, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., or an unauthorized loading of the floors. That would overcome. So they actually have a safety factor involved in there. But here's how they can squeeze out of it. That additional safety factor is not designed to prevent a progressive collapse. The dynamic weight of one floor above freely falling on the floor below, particularly the dynamic weight of 15 stories falling. But that would never happen because, if it did happen, it would never happen at near free fall acceleration. It would decelerate and then stop, as we've shown today in this webinar. So NIST can kind of squeeze out of that. I hope that helps. That's a great question for a structural engineer, but that's my understanding of how it works at that superficial level.
All right, our next question says, it is weird how when it came to Building 7, NIST wanted people to think there was all kinds of structural resistance taking place before the final collapse, and that it took a sequence of structural failures to happen before the roof line finally fell. But when it came to the Twin Towers, NIST wanted people to think the exact opposite, and that the structural resistance offered was essentially zero resistance. Let's be honest, NIST said the Twin Towers fell essentially in free fall, and by definition that also means essentially zero structural resistance. Why did NIST say one building had structural resistance and the other 2 didn't?
This is an interesting question and a great question for NIST. We'll add that one to the series of great questions for NIST. What they're trying to do in Building 7 is claim that the interior collapsed first after the progressive collapse began near column 79, floor 13 fell on 12, and so on, because column 79 was unbraced. So, yes, they do say that there was buckling that was overcome inside, and they can get away with implying that didn't happen at free fall, but they can't do that on the outside. So on the perimeter structure, which they say fell many seconds after the interior fell, they're saying that the buckling was occurring during the time when there was no movement of the structure. And at first they denied there was any free fall. They said if there was free fall, then that would mean there'd be no structure. But the exterior did fall at free fall for a third of its 7-second fall. So what they don't explain is how that happened while columns were buckling in the exterior. And so in the case of the Twin Towers, yes, 90% of the load was removed somehow. 90% of the structural resistance of the columns was removed so that the building could come down at 64% of free fall, as analyzed, as we saw by David Chandler. So they're saying the columns buckled not during the collapse, because if they were buckling during the collapse, we saw that slide that shows the columns always have at least a quarter of their resistive capacity. So they would never collapse at free fall. But NIST has to ignore that. And basically, they do say it came down essentially at free fall. That's an incoherent statement, knowing that columns always, even after they've buckled, have a quarter of their strength left. So I hope that provides some insight there. But the rest of this question, I think we need to dump onto NIST.
Absolutely. Now, I said there were 4 questions. It turns out there were only 3. I miscounted, so this is the last one.
Oh.
I said, was NIST ever asked why the North Tower lasted much longer than the South Tower? It was hit by the airplane much higher, where the steel was thinner, and where damage and fire would have been much worse. And especially, it was a more direct hit through the core width-wise compared to the off-center hit of the South Tower's core lengthwise.
Yeah, NIST's squeezes out of this one. I don't have the explanation at hand. I can only imagine that there is one. The fires were not hotter in the South Tower, so that's not their explanation. The South Tower was hit at the corner, so fewer core columns were hit. Do you have any insight into what NIST's explanation for that might be, Andy?
No, I don't. So that's something we can look up. And if the person wants to write to us at info@ae911truth.org and let us know who they are, because I can't see who's submitting these questions. We made them so that you're anonymous. Let us know, and we can get back to you on that and give you a good answer.
Yes, and please compile these great questions, and we'll send them to NIST.
There you go. We're doing their job for them. So that is for the questions. I just want to let everyone know we got a new article out on the website that chronicles all the reports of explosions at the scene that day on September 11th. A lot of great reference materials and video clips in it, so please check that out. A bulletin went out, I think, yesterday on this thing.
Yep.
So definitely worth a read.
I saw it myself. Hundreds of hours of research by Graham McIlvain and Ted Walter. We have dozens and dozens of reporters talking about explosions, in addition to the firefighters that we heard from today. It was the operating hypothesis on the street the day of 9/11, and it all changed. And that's what happens when you get 95% of the mainstream media owned by just 5 corporations, per the work of Sonoma State, the project censored there. Read their book on this. It's incredible. But today we looked at the explosive destruction of the towers. Next week we go into this extreme heat. A lot more evidence on incendiaries and explosives, particularly incendiaries and the extreme hot fires. So be sure to join us at 1 p.m. on Thursday Pacific time. And then it starts all over in August with part 1 at the World Trade Center Building 7. So it's the first 3 Thursdays each month. So be sure to join us. And I'd like to thank Andy and everybody else. And until then, bye for now.